What if I told you that everything you think you know about Victorian education, those sepia-toned images of well-behaved children in neat rows, diligently copying lessons while a kindly schoolmaster looks on, is nothing more than a carefully constructed myth? The truth is far more sinister, far more brutal, and infinitely more psychologically devastating than any period drama has dared to show you. If you were transported back to a Victorian classroom tomorrow, you wouldn't find yourself in a quaint scene of moral instruction and academic rigor. You would find yourself trapped in a machine designed not to educate your mind, but to break your spirit and reshape you into an obedient cog in the industrial empire. The Victorian school system, particularly after the Education Act of 1870 made schooling compulsory for children aged 5 to 10, was not primarily an institution of learning. It was a factory for manufacturing compliance, a training ground for submission, and a laboratory for testing how much psychological and physical torture a child could endure, while still remaining functional enough to serve the needs of an expanding empire. The romantic notion of Victorian education as character-building discipline masks a darker reality: systematic child abuse disguised as moral instruction, conducted on an industrial scale, and celebrated as civilization's greatest achievement. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Intimidation. The moment you approached a Victorian school building, you encountered your first lesson in powerlessness. These imposing Gothic structures, built of dark brick and stone, rose from the industrial landscape like secular cathedrals, dedicated to the worship of authority. But their cathedral-like appearance was deceptive. Where real cathedrals lifted the spirit toward heaven, these buildings were designed to crush the soul into submission. The architects of these educational fortresses understood psychology better than they understood pedagogy. The windows were placed deliberately high, often 6 feet or more from the ground, not for better light or ventilation as claimed, but to prevent children from looking out at the world beyond. Once you passed through those heavy iron gates, you were cut off from life itself. The outside world ceased to exist. You entered a hermetically sealed environment where the only reality was the will of your masters. Step inside, and the assault on your senses would begin immediately. The air was thick and suffocating, heavy with the exhalations of hundreds of unwashed bodies packed into spaces designed for half their number. In winter, the contrast was particularly cruel. While school board members debated budgets in heated offices, children sat in classrooms warmed by a single, inadequate coal stove. If fortune placed you near the stove, you roasted on one side while freezing on the other. If you sat in the back rows, the ink in your inkwell would literally freeze, and your breath would ghost visibly in the frigid air. The smell was a complex symphony of misery, damp wool that never fully dried, the sour tang of unwashed bodies, coal smoke that seeped through every crack, and the metallic scent of fear-induced sweat. Over it all hung the acrid dust of chalk, coating throats and lungs, making every breath a reminder of where you were and why you were there. Your body would be assaulted by the furniture itself. The wooden benches were deliberately uncomfortable, long, hard surfaces without backs, designed to prevent slouching and ensure that sitting for hours became its own form of punishment. These benches forced children to maintain rigid posture for 6 hours daily, straining developing spines and creating a physical memory of submission that would last a lifetime. To slouch was to invite a sharp rap across the shoulders. Comfort was seen as moral weakness, a luxury that bred laziness and distraction. The sensory torture extended to the tools of learning. Paper was too expensive for practice, so you would spend your days scratching away at a slate, a small piece of black rock framed in wood, using a slate pencil that produced an excruciating screech with every mark. Imagine a classroom of 60 children, all scratching simultaneously at their slates, creating a cacophony that set teeth on edge and frayed nerves to breaking point. When you made a mistake, there was no eraser. You spat on the slate and wiped it with your sleeve, adding the smell and sight of collective saliva to the classroom's atmosphere of degradation. This physical environment was not accidental or the result of limited resources. It was carefully calculated psychological conditioning. The Victorian educational philosophy held that comfort corrupted character, that hardship built moral fiber, and that a child's natural impulses toward movement, curiosity, and comfort were inherently sinful and needed to be systematically suppressed. Every aspect of the school building reinforced the message that you were powerless, that your physical needs were irrelevant, and that your only value lay in your ability to endure suffering without complaint. But the building itself was merely the stage for a far more sophisticated system of control. Behind the fade of educational progress lay an invisible machinery of surveillance and betrayal that turned children into instruments of their own oppression. The question that would haunt you as you sat on those hard benches, surrounded by the sounds and smells of institutional misery, was not whether you would be watched, but who among your fellow prisoners had been recruited to watch you. Chapter 2. The Hierarchy of Broken Souls. The true genius of the Victorian school system lay not in its visible cruelty, but in its invisible architecture of surveillance and control. If you imagine that your tormentor would be the adult teacher standing at the front of the room, you fundamentally misunderstood how the system worked. The Victorian classroom was a complex ecosystem of power, fear, and betrayal, where children were systematically turned against each other in service of institutional control. The foundation of this system was the monitorial method, developed as a cost-cutting measure but refined into a tool of psychological warfare. In a typical board school, one master might oversee 300 children. Direct instruction was impossible, so the system created a pyramid of oppression. The master taught a handful of older, brighter boys, the monitors, who then drilled groups of younger children. But these monitors were not merely teaching assistants. They were enforcers, investigators, and judges rolled into one. Imagine being 7 years old, struggling to memorize the kings of England, and your immediate authority figure is not a trained adult, but a 12-year-old boy from your own neighborhood who has been given a taste of absolute power. These child overseers were armed with the authority to punish, to report infractions, and to humiliate their charges publicly. They carried canes and were encouraged to use them. The psychological impact was devastating. Your tormentor was someone who should have been your ally, someone who shared your powerlessness but had chosen collaboration over solidarity. This system created an environment of constant paranoia. There was no safety in numbers because the numbers had been weaponized against you. The boy sitting beside you might be promoted to monitor next week. The girl sharing your bench might report your whispered question to curry favor with the pupil teacher. Every relationship was potentially transactional, every conversation potentially dangerous. It was a training ground for a society built on surveillance and informants, where survival depended on your ability to navigate shifting loyalties and hidden agendas. Above the monitors sat the pupil teachers, teenagers aged 13 to 18, who occupied a liminal space between student and staff. These young people were apprenticed to the schoolmaster. Their entire future depended on maintaining order in their assigned section and passing rigorous annual examinations. The pressure was enormous. Failure meant not just personal disappointment, but potential descent into the working class, a fate their families viewed as worse than death. This pressure manifested as cruelty. A 15-year-old pupil teacher, exhausted from working 12-hour days and terrified of failing his apprenticeship, had little patience for slow learners or disruption. These teenage enforcers were often the most brutal because they had the most to lose. They were the tragic middle managers of this factory of compliance, trapped between the crushing expectations of their masters and the unruly mass of children below them. They ground students down even as they were being ground down themselves. The invisible world extended beyond the classroom into every corner of the school experience. Daily cleanliness inspections became rituals of public humiliation. Children from the poorest slums, who had no access to running water or soap, were lined up and examined like livestock. Those found wanting, with lice, dirty fingernails, or unwashed clothes, were singled out for public shame. In some schools, heads were shaved in front of the entire class, the smell of carbolic soap becoming forever associated with degradation and social marking. The playground offered no respite from this hierarchy of oppression. Victorian playgrounds were hard-surfaced enclosures surrounded by high brick walls, with minimal supervision and no safety equipment. The games were violent, stone-throwing, dangerous gymnastics on iron bars, and ritualized fighting. For the weak or timid, recess was not a break from classroom torture, but a descent into Lord of the Flies anarchy, where the strong preyed upon the weak under the indifferent gaze of authorities who viewed such struggles as character building. Even the process of learning became a tool of surveillance. Children were required to recite in unison, their voices blending into a hypnotic drone that made individual thought impossible. But within this collective chanting, monitors listened for hesitation, mispronunciation, or lack of enthusiasm. Your voice could betray you even when your actions remained perfectly compliant. The rhythm of group recitation became a heartbeat of conformity, and any irregularity was noted, reported, and punished. The psychological impact of this system extended far beyond the immediate fear and discomfort. Children learned that survival required constant vigilance, that trust was dangerous, and that power was something to be sought and wielded over others rather than shared or questioned. They internalized the message that their worth was determined not by their inherent humanity, but by their position in an arbitrary hierarchy, and that maintaining that position required the systematic betrayal of those below them. But perhaps most insidiously, this invisible world taught children that the system itself was natural and inevitable. The monitors who beat them had once been beaten themselves. The pupil teachers who humiliated them were themselves humiliated by their masters. The cycle of oppression was presented not as a human choice, but as the natural order of things, as immutable as gravity or the changing seasons. Yet even this elaborate machinery of control was merely the foundation for something even more devastating. A curriculum designed not to expand minds, but to imprison them. Not to encourage thinking, but to make it impossible. The question that haunted the Victorian classroom was not what children would learn, but what they would be prevented from learning, and how the very process of education could be transformed into an instrument of intellectual suffocation. Chapter 3. The curriculum of mental imprisonment. If the physical environment was designed to break your body, and the social system engineered to fracture your spirit, the curriculum itself was crafted to imprison your mind. The Victorian approach to learning was not education in any meaningful sense. It was intellectual lobotomy performed through repetition, a systematic destruction of curiosity disguised as academic rigor. The key to understanding this mental torture lies in the Revised Code of 1862, which introduced the payment by results system. This policy transformed schools from places of learning into examination factories. Government funding depended entirely on how well students performed on annual tests in the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. If students failed, schools lost money. If schools lost money, teachers faced salary cuts or dismissal. The psychological impact on educators was immediate and devastating. Teachers, terrified of financial ruin, abandoned any pretense of creative or engaging instruction. The classroom became a drill hall where the only goal was successful regurgitation of information on examination day. Imagine sitting on those hard benches for 6 hours daily, doing nothing but chanting. CAT spells cat, RAT spells rat, BAT spells bat. The entire class would drone in unison, voices rising and falling in hypnotic rhythm that continued for hours until the words lost all meaning and became mere sounds echoing off cold stone walls. This was not teaching, it was mental conditioning. There was no discussion, no exploration, no attempt to connect learning to life or experience. To ask why was to disrupt the drill. To show curiosity was to risk the cane. To express interest in topics beyond the narrow curriculum was to mark yourself as disruptive and potentially dangerous. The natural intellectual curiosity that drives all genuine learning was systematically beaten out of children, sometimes literally. History became a list of dates and battles to be memorized like grocery lists. 1066 Battle of Hastings, 1415 Battle of Agincourt, 1588 Spanish Armada. There was no exploration of causes or consequences, no attempt to help children understand the sweep of human events or their place within the great story of civilization. Geography was reduced to memorizing capital cities and rivers without ever seeing proper maps or understanding why these places mattered. Literature was not about the beauty of language or the exploration of human experience. It was about parsing sentences and analyzing grammar until every trace of joy was strangled from the words. For girls, the intellectual prison was even smaller and more suffocating. While boys endured the mind-numbing repetition of academic subjects, girls were frequently pulled from lessons to learn domestic accomplishments. Hours were spent on needlework, stitching samplers with moral sayings while their eyes strained in dim light and their backs ached from hunching over tiny stitches. The hidden curriculum was clear. Your mind is less important than your utility as a future wife, mother, or servant. Your horizon should extend no further than the domestic sphere. The teaching methods themselves were instruments of psychological torture. Children stood in rows for recitation, called upon randomly to demonstrate their memorization. Every hesitation, every mispronunciation was noted and punished. The fear of being called upon created a constant state of anxiety that made actual learning nearly impossible. Your heart would race as the teacher's eyes scanned the rows, knowing that a moment's inattention or a failure of memory would result in public humiliation and physical pain. Writing lessons were equally soul-crushing. Children spent hours copying passages in perfect copperplate script, forming letters with mechanical precision while their hands cramped and their minds went numb. There was no creative writing, no expression of personal thoughts or experiences, no opportunity to use language as a tool for exploration or communication. Writing became a purely mechanical skill, divorced from thought or meaning. Arithmetic was perhaps the most brutal subject of all. Children stood in formation and recited multiplication tables in unison, their voices creating a droning chant that went on so long the numbers became meaningless sounds. 7 times 7 is 49, 7 times 8 is 56, 7 times 9 is 63. The rhythm was hypnotic, designed to bypass conscious thought and embed responses at a purely mechanical level. If you made a mistake, you were pulled from the line and made to stand facing the wall wearing a dunce cap, a tall, conical hat that marked you as intellectually inferior. The dunce cap deserves special attention as an instrument of psychological torture. Far from the cartoon image we might have today, it was a devastating tool of public humiliation. You would stand for hours, sometimes entire days, facing the wall while wearing this symbol of intellectual failure. Other children were encouraged to laugh at and mock you, reinforcing the message that academic struggle was not a normal part of learning, but a moral failing worthy of contempt. The cap taught you that your worth as a human being was tied entirely to your performance, that making mistakes was shameful, and that intellectual difficulty marked you as fundamentally defective. Religious instruction, which occupied a significant portion of each day, was conducted in the same spirit of mechanical repetition. Children memorized Bible verses and catechism responses without any discussion of meaning or relevance. Religion became not a source of comfort or spiritual exploration, but another set of rules to be memorized and regurgitated on command. The moral lessons were always about obedience, humility, and acceptance of one's station in life. Critical thinking about religious or moral questions was not just discouraged, it was viewed as dangerous and potentially heretical. The cumulative effect of this curriculum was the systematic destruction of intellectual curiosity and creative thinking. Children learned that knowledge was something imposed from above rather than discovered through exploration. They learned that their own thoughts and questions were irrelevant or dangerous. They learned that learning itself was a painful mechanical process rather than a joyful journey of discovery. Most devastatingly, they learned that their minds belonged not to them, but to the system, to be filled with approved content and emptied of unapproved thoughts. But even as we recoil from this intellectual imprisonment, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The system was remarkably effective at achieving its actual goals. It created a workforce that was literate enough to follow written instructions, but not educated enough to question authority. It produced citizens who could perform basic calculations, but had no understanding of logic or critical reasoning. It manufactured minds that were filled with approved information, but empty of independent thought. The question that haunts us as we observe this systematic destruction of human intellectual potential is not just what was done to these children, but what was lost to humanity itself. How many potential scientists, artists, philosophers, and innovators were crushed by this machine of mental conformity? How many discoveries were never made? How many works of art never created? How many social reforms never conceived? Because the minds capable of such achievements had been systematically trained not to think. As we prepare to examine the final cost of this educational holocaust, we must ask ourselves, what kind of society emerges when an entire generation has been taught that thinking is dangerous, that curiosity is punishable, and that the highest virtue is unquestioning obedience to authority? Chapter 4. The Manufacture of Misery. The Victorian education system did not merely fail to educate, it succeeded brilliantly at its true purpose: the mass production of psychologically damaged adults who would accept suffering as natural, authority as unquestionable, and their own powerlessness as morally deserved. The children who survived this systematic torture emerged as the administrators of empire, the managers of factories, and the enforcers of a social order built on the very principles that had been beaten into them during their school years. The psychological scarring was profound and permanent. Adults who had endured Victorian schooling carried specific trauma patterns that shaped their entire lives. They had learned that feelings were dangerous, that showing pain marked you as weak, that expressing enthusiasm invited punishment, and that empathy made you vulnerable. The ideal graduate of the Victorian system was someone who could endure anything without complaint, but who also struggled to feel anything at all. This emotional numbness became the dark foundation of Britain's imperial success. The men who could send children into coal mines, who could order mass executions in colonial territories, who could design factory systems that ground workers into early graves, these were not monsters born of genetic abnormality. They were the predictable products of an educational system that had systematically cauterized their capacity for empathy during their formative years. The cruelty of the Victorian world was not accidental. It was the direct output of its schools. For working-class children, the education system served as vocational training for industrial servitude. The bells that marked class periods were identical to the factory whistles that would later govern their shifts. The silence required at desks prepared them for the silence required at looms and assembly lines. The physical discomfort of hard benches in cold rooms normalized the horrific conditions they would later accept in mills and mines. They were pre-broken, their bodies and minds already conditioned to accept suffering as the natural price of survival. The monitorial system that had turned children against each other became the template for industrial management. Former monitors became foremen, who could enforce discipline without empathy. Former pupils learned to accept hierarchy as natural and inevitable. The surveillance techniques perfected in Victorian classrooms, the constant watching, the reporting of infractions, the punishment of solidarity, became the foundation of industrial labor relations. But perhaps most insidiously, the system taught children to internalize their oppression. Working-class students learned that they were poor because they were morally inferior, that their suffering was the result of personal failings rather than systemic injustice. They carried this message into adulthood, becoming workers who blamed themselves for their poverty, parents who beat their children for their own good, and citizens who never questioned why a few lived in luxury while many lived in misery. The class divisions reinforced by Victorian education created parallel but separate psychological damage in different social strata. Middle-class children, subjected to intense academic pressure and rigid social training, developed their own forms of trauma. They learned that their worth depended entirely on performance, that failure meant social death, and that emotional expression was a luxury they could not afford. They became adults who could maintain perfect facades while dying inside, who could follow social rules with mechanical precision while losing touch with their own humanity. The elite public school system produced perhaps the most psychologically damaged individuals of all. The fagging system, where younger boys served as virtual slaves to older ones, created a cycle of abuse that prepared students for imperial administration. Boys who were beaten and humiliated at 12 became the beaters and humiliators at 17. They learned that power was something to be wielded over others, that suffering was character building, and that emotional connection was weakness. These elite school survivors became the administrators of empire, men who could govern colonial territories with ruthless efficiency because their own capacity for human connection had been systematically destroyed. The stiff upper lip that became synonymous with British character was actually a mask for deep psychological scarring, a learned inability to access or express emotion that had been literally beaten into them during their school years. The boarding school experience was particularly devastating because it combined educational trauma with parental abandonment. Wealthy parents paid enormous sums to send their sons away, effectively abandoning them to closed societies governed by institutionalized cruelty. These boys learned that love was conditional, that family bonds could be severed for the sake of social advancement, and that emotional needs were signs of weakness to be suppressed. The living conditions in elite schools were often deliberately harsh: unheated dormitories, inadequate food, physical deprivation designed to toughen character. Boys at the most expensive schools in the world lived in conditions that would be considered criminal neglect today, all justified as preparation for leadership. The contrast was staggering. The wealthiest children in society, living in squalor and hunger, learning that privilege came with the price of emotional death. The long-term consequences of this systematic child abuse extended far beyond individual trauma. Victorian education created entire generations of adults who were incapable of recognizing or addressing the suffering they inflicted on others. Parents who beat their children believed they were showing love. Teachers who terrorized students thought they were building character. Employers who created hellish working conditions saw themselves as providing opportunities. The cycle was self-perpetuating because the victims became the perpetrators. Adults who had survived Victorian schooling often became fierce defenders of the system that had damaged them, arguing that their own suffering had made them stronger and that subsequent generations needed the same harsh treatment. This intergenerational transmission of trauma meant that Victorian educational practices persisted long after the Victorian era ended, their influence visible in schools, families, and institutions well into the 20th century. The social cost of this mass psychological damage was enormous. Britain became a society that valued order over justice, discipline over compassion, and hierarchy over equality. The emotional skills necessary for healthy relationships, effective parenting, and democratic governance were systematically eliminated from the population. The result was a civilization that could build railways and conquer continents, but struggled to create happiness or genuine human connection. Yet even as we document this catalog of horrors, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that the Victorian education system was not an aberration or accident. It was a rational response to the needs of an industrial society that required obedient workers, compliant citizens, and emotionally detached administrators. The people who designed and implemented this system were not sadistic monsters, but individuals operating within a particular worldview and set of social pressures. This recognition should humble us as we examine our own educational practices. What assumptions about children, learning, and society are embedded in our current systems? What forms of damage might we be inflicting while believing we are helping? What practices that we consider normal and necessary today will future generations view as we now view Victorian schools. The Victorian education system offers us a mirror in which to examine our own reflection. It shows us what happens when societies prioritize control over growth, compliance over creativity, and institutional needs over human development. It reminds us that educational practices are never neutral. They always serve particular purposes and create particular kinds of human beings. As we stand at the exit of this historical examination, looking back at the imposing fade of the Victorian schoolhouse, the romantic mist clears completely. We see not a quaint scene from a period drama, but a factory for manufacturing compliance, a laboratory for testing how much psychological and physical torture children could endure while remaining functional enough to serve imperial needs. We see the true cost of the good old days. Generations of children whose spirits were systematically broken in service of a civilization that valued order over humanity. The question that haunts us is not just what was done to these children, but what we have learned from their suffering. Have we truly evolved beyond the Victorian model, or have we simply found more sophisticated ways to achieve the same ends? Are our schools places of genuine learning and human development, or are they, like their Victorian predecessors, institutions designed primarily to produce compliant citizens for the needs of the state and economy? The ghosts of Victorian schoolchildren are still with us, their silent screams echoing through the corridors of every school that prioritizes test scores over curiosity, discipline over creativity, and institutional convenience over human flourishing. Their legacy challenges us to ask the most important question of all. What kind of adults are we creating? And what kind of world will they build with the tools we have given them? If you found yourself grateful for your modern freedoms after this journey, or if you recognize echoes of Victorian methods in your own educational experiences, you have begun to understand the true lesson of history. The past is not a foreign country. It lives within our institutions, our assumptions, and our unconscious practices. Only by confronting the darkness of what came before can we hope to create something genuinely better for the children who depend on us today. The Victorian school system was not just a historical curiosity. It was a warning about what happens when societies forget that education should serve children rather than using children to serve education. The question now is whether we have the wisdom to heed that warning, or whether future generations will look back at our educational practices with the same horror we feel when examining the systematic cruelty inflicted on Victorian children in the name of civilization and progress.